Welcome to the Success Talk Show, the podcast for ambitious leaders who want to get their best results and create a workplace for their teams to thrive. Each week, we share practical advice to help you accelerate your success and grow as an inspiring leader. Now, here's your host, Leadership Success Coach, Donna Siriani.
Welcome to another episode of the Success Talk Show. This is Donna Siriani. And now, for you to be successful, it's important that you have a solid approach to decision making. So in this episode, I will share with you 3 emotional intelligence skills that are crucial for you to achieve this. In fact, 2 of the 3 skills are so critical that if you don't master them, they can actually derail your career. So I'll cover what those derailers are at the end of the episode. Now, when I talk about success with respect to decision making, what I mean is you have a good understanding of problems, you create effective solutions, you deal realistically with situations, and you manage impulses that may actually disrupt effective decision making. So before I dive into these skills, I just want to mention that if you missed the first few episodes in the series, you can find them at thesuccesstalkshow.com or in iTunes, whichever you prefer. Now, I encourage you to go back and listen to them, especially the first episode, What Every Leader Must Know, because in that episode, I share a few important facts about emotional intelligence and how it relates to your own professional success. So it really gives you the context for why this is important, and it really gives context for the whole series. Now, if you'd like to download what the list of the 15 skills, what those are, you can go to my website, successcompassstrategies.com/emotional-intelligence. And there you'll find a PDF that you can download. It gives you the list of all 15. So let's dive in. The 3 skills I'll be covering in this episode are reality testing, problem solving, and impulse control. And as I said, all 3 relate to decision making. Now, I have to admit, I love talking about reality testing. I could make the whole episode about this because here's what reality testing is. It's the ability to see things objectively, the way they are, not the way you want them to be, or perhaps the way you fear them to be. It's your ability to be pragmatic, to tune into a situation, and again, see things and approach a situation looking at data, logic, facts, observation, evidence, right? Not just what you're wishing or fearing to be true. Now, that sounds pretty logical, right? You won't be able to make the best decision possible in a situation if you're approaching it without all the facts. Yet the reality is that decision making can be highly emotional, right? Now, you will stand out from the crowd when you're able to flex your reality testing muscle and cut through the emotion and see things how they really are. You're really going to stand out as a leader when you're good at this, okay? So to that point, I just want to share a couple of really quick stories about how this, like I said, I love this topic and spending my entire career, 35 years in technology, and like you, I've had to constantly be looking at evidence, data, facts, trends, statistics, etc., to assess a situation, solve a problem, or make a decision, right? That just comes with, most of our roles in a corporate life. So anyway, I want to share a quick story with you. I worked for a technology company that serviced the financial services industry, and there came a time when the executive team for my company really started to put more pressure on the Asia region to grow revenue from within the region. And I remember sitting in on an executive team meeting, and I heard the head of sales really pointing the finger at client services, the organization that I had belonged to, saying they were the reason that revenue wasn't hitting the books fast enough, pointing the finger at the team in Asia. And they were just taking too long to get client projects up and running. So, fast forward, when I was asked to take over the client services organization in Asia, naturally, I immediately started to do my own reality testing. What was true, what was rumor, what was speculation, what was perception, right? Started to do some reality testing. Now, no one in the region, at least in the organization I took over, really had the project details or numbers that I needed to truly understand what was happening. So I set up a weekly meeting between sales and client services within the region. These are people that work for me as well as key members of the sales team. And every week, just for half an hour, we'd go over the numbers line by line. And I started to build out a simple Excel spreadsheet, which helped me separate fact from fiction. So what do you think happened? It turned out there wasn't a big problem in client services, big surprise. Instead, what I uncovered were a number of issues with how sales was actually handling the pre-sales effort. Talented team, lots of good people, but again, there was this harsh criticism. When I say good team, we had a fantastic sales team. The client services team was great, but here was the problem. Lots of finger pointing, lots of criticism for not finishing projects. But you know what? After I started tracking the data and sharing it with people, that criticism just never came up again. And my next assignment after that was for the same company, was to relocate to New York in the financial district and tackle another problem situation. Now, I took over a group who was accused of extremely poor turnaround times on critical client work. Here again, a situation where I was relocating, coming in brand new to a team, and people around them were very unhappy with their performance. So as you can imagine, right, the first thing I did was started collecting and analyzing data. The team processed 55 different types of requests. Now, shockingly, no one was tracking turnaround times. So we started tracking it. Not hard, not rocket science, but in less than 6 months, everything was really right on track, right? Really, really good performance. Now, they were really good at what they were doing, but here's the catch. And you probably have heard this expression. You can't improve what you don't measure. Or said differently, what you measure and track is what you end up improving, right? You'll see the results. Now, this has been true time and time again for anything I've ever worked on. How about for you? I'm sure as you're listening to this, doesn't matter what function you're in, sales, marketing, technology, if you're in an engineering role, product role, doesn't matter. When you're measuring and tracking, that gives you your reality test. So think about your own situation and the challenges you are facing today. Are people making all types of claims, pushing their agenda, trying to sway others to a certain decision, trying to get their way, and maybe they don't have all the facts? You might be thinking, yeah, that happens every day. But it's so easy to get swept up in emotions because, in the workplace, sometimes the stakes are really high. People may be feeling threatened by another group. They themselves aren't performing, so they're trying to point the finger at another team, or they're just irritated on why things aren't getting done. They may mistrust other people's agendas, and so on. The scenarios go on, but there's so much emotion. And if you're operating in a climate where organizational changes are imminent, or at least suspected, then emotions may be over the top or supercharged because all of these emotions are undoubtedly clouding decision making. So without doing reality testing, for me personally, when I shared those 2 quick stories, I could have walked into those situations as the new leader, taking over new teams. I could have relied solely what I was being told by other leaders. Because based on their perception of what was happening, I could have said, well, if that's the case, and made some very, very bad decisions if I really listened to what everyone was saying and didn't do any of my own reality testing. Because sometimes what people are saying is based on these emotions and based on whether they actually like the people that are involved or whether they trust them and so on, and what's at stake, right? So you can be the voice of reason by flexing your reality testing muscles. And I want to give you a couple of tips. First tip, think of a situation you're facing right now, either a problem or an opportunity, something that's pressing on your mind, and jot down what your thoughts are about this. Now, I want you to debate both sides of the argument, good and bad, pros and cons. Make a list. What are all the good things I'm thinking about this or the negative thoughts I have about this problem or opportunity? When you finish making the list, I want you to ask yourself, what observable, measurable evidence do you have to base these key points on? Okay, so that's Tip number 1 is to think of something you're facing right now and go through that exercise, because it's going to train your mind to be thinking and catch yourself when you're making assumptions. You're based on your emotions that you're basing it on could be excitement, eagerness, trust, confidence, enthusiasm for something, and it's really not based on reality. Or it could be you're worried, anxious, frustrated, losing sleep over something. And maybe you don't have really any evidence that says you should even be worried about that, right? So this particular tip is to basically get started with your own self-reflection on how are you letting your emotions impact your thoughts on a very specific situation right now. Tip number 2, the next tip, is when something comes up over the next week, I want you to pause when you're faced with a problem or an opportunity. Pause and ask yourself the exact same question. So before you jump to a conclusion, ask yourself, what observable or measurable evidence do you have to base your opinion on in terms of next step, an action to take, an opinion to express, a point of view, or again, it could be an action. But now take it one step further and ask yourself, what data or evidence do you need to collect based on what's missing? Now, it's important to catch yourself in the moment for a few reasons. One, you want to stop the negative self-talk. Pause before you go into that negative spiral. Or conversely, catch yourself before you get too excited about something prematurely. Like, don't get overly excited about a new role that you've heard about when you haven't even applied, you haven't even had an interview, and yet you're all excited and you're already thinking about it, right? Don't get ahead of yourself. Now, it's easy to, depending on your personality, right? This is an opportunity for you to reflect on what comes naturally to you. You may have a natural tendency that when you're under a lot of stress, you might worry about a catastrophe. You might go to the worst case scenario. You always jump to what's the worst thing that can happen and assume that that's what will happen. Again, when you're under a lot of stress. And you may have that tendency all the time. You need to try and keep yourself in check and recognize this as it's happening. On the other hand, your personality could be to sugarcoat things, right? So if you know that, you're always looking at the silver lining, always looking at the bright side, you're always optimistic, well, that's very nice to be so positive, depending on the problem or decision you're trying to solve or the decision you're trying to make. You need to catch yourself sugarcoating things and being too optimistic when there's really no evidence. So what I want you to do in that situation is try playing devil's advocate. And if you catch yourself doing that, ask yourself, what if these things I'm assuming are not true? Then what? What would be my course of action? Okay, so you're looking for reality testing somewhere in the middle, what kind of data you have. Now, whether you dwell on worst case or best case, this could be a natural tendency for you that could be good for you to know. Now, I've worked with lots of people who always go to worst case, and their intention wasn't to be negative all the time. It was to protect us in terms of risk. If we implement this and this doesn't go well, this is what could happen. Here's the risk or impact. So their intentions were always good, but you just have to be careful as to where that plays into reality testing and the ultimate decision. So the last tip on this one is stay tuned into what's going on with your team and the organization. So what's happening with your team right now? What's happening with workload, with new challenges? What are they facing? And what's happening in the organization overall? What are the changes that might be coming down the road that people are worried about? Because all of these things, when you're really tuned into your organization, you can then use your reality testing skills to make the best decisions on how to handle what comes next. Got to stay tuned into the reality of what's going on. Okay, so that's reality testing. So let's switch over to problem solving. Now, problem solving, of course, you need good reality testing, right? So we'll circle back on that. But as a leader, you're probably solving problems every single day. So you may already have very good problem solving skills. Now, if you've ever taken a workshop on problem solving, you probably learned that there are generally 6 basic steps. Okay, and I'll just list them off. Describe the problem, accurately. Generate alternative solutions to the problem. Usually you would use brainstorming. You will evaluate each alternative, choose the best option, then implement the option that you selected, and then evaluate the outcome. Was the problem solved? What was the outcome? What were the results? So those are the basic 6 steps of a problem solving process. But the distinction here, when I'm talking about problem solving in terms of emotional intelligence, it's the ability to find solutions to problems in situations where emotions are involved. It's to understand how emotions impact decision making. That's a skill. So the challenge here is to confront problems rather than to avoid them. Now, have you ever tried to solve a problem when people involved are reacting with such strong emotions that you can see that it's clouding their judgment? You can see that they're either too excited or too upset or too frustrated. You can just see that their emotions are taking over. Now, the tendency, both for you and for them, could be to skip some of these basic 6 steps, to problem solving. For whatever reason, it could be based on lack of trust. It could be fear, frustration, anxiety, whatever's happening. It could be that for some reason, you might jump straight to implementing a solution without the proper due diligence of going through all the steps. Or, maybe you are trying to go through the steps, but when you try to generate different alternatives, the people that you're brainstorming with to identify those alternatives, emotion gets in the way. People are not thinking clearly. They're stuck. They're not coming up with anything because they're afraid to speak out, say what they think because of some change that could trigger. So emotions can show up at any one of these steps. Anyway, I want to share a quick story with you that I will never forget on the first time that I would say this really showed up in a big way in an important problem-solving exercise. So I'll always remember my colleagues and I had a meeting with 2 senior executives to present our recommendations to solve a technology issue that we deemed critical. Now, the 2 senior executives were the head of our division and the head of the division that we needed to give final approval. We considered him, our client. Let's say we were data center and he was, application development, product development. So his name was Ray. He's a great guy, very friendly, charismatic guy. He was sitting at the head of a very, very long conference room table. Now, it was a very formal setting, very formal meeting. Now, since we were all in technology, of course, everybody around the table was well versed in how to present a compelling case with facts and figures, right? We had all the details documented. And we wanted Ray's approval. But after every little detail had already been discussed, we still couldn't seem to convince Ray to approve the solution. Finally, he leaned forward, he slapped his hands down on the conference room table and just exclaimed, and he actually was whining. He goes, "I just don't want to do it." And I'm not being funny. I mean, he really was that whiny. He shared his fears and concerns and anxiety. And I have to admit, I had never seen anyone do that before. We were speechless. So eventually, after he got it all off his chest, the meeting ended. He said he'd think about it some more. Now, no decision was made in that meeting. Eventually a solution came around, but it didn't happen quickly. There was so much emotion around this issue for him that we just couldn't come to a conclusion. So anyway, my point is, it was my first situation where I could see more clearly, right, how emotions can impact problem solving. Because we thought we had an open and shut case, okay? Now, when emotions are involved, at any step of the way, you may see it. And the question is, are you going to take it into account, give someone the opportunity to express their concerns at the start of the process or, as you go along? Just don't try to deny it. Don't try to assume that it doesn't exist because it will rear its head every step of the way. So here's an exercise for you. I'd like you to think about how you're handling problems that you're encountering. What are the challenges that you're facing at work right now? The quick exercise would be, I want you to spend a few minutes reflecting on an actual situation that's happened in the past week. Write down a problem you experienced. Now, you can describe it as either technical or interpersonal. It could be a technical issue, something that went wrong. Or it could be interpersonal. There's a problem between you and another person or you and a group or your group and another group. And make some notes on how you attempted to solve the problem. After you make your list and you look at your notes, ask yourself, did you go through the 6 basic steps of problem solving that I mentioned? Or did you skip a few steps? For example, Maybe you didn't generate alternatives, but instead you jumped right to a solution. Okay, so how did that turn out? Now, when you think through this, that's just an example. You maybe skipped another step. Maybe you didn't skip any steps, but ask yourself, how you did in solving that problem. And when you think it through, what did you learn about your tendencies or habits? And what would you like to do differently next time? Okay. So a couple more tips is over the next week or two, I want you to be even more aware of how you're reacting to and addressing a new problem. And it doesn't have to be every single problem you encounter, but we're talking about problems when emotions are involved. So I want you to pause for a minute when you're faced with the problem. Notice what emotions are coming up for you or the other person, and revisit those 6 steps. Notice where in the process people are getting stuck. So going back to that meeting with Ray where he said, had a meltdown, it wasn't going to approve our request. If we had been in closer contact with him before making this, presentation, maybe we would have been more in tune with the emotions that were running high, even in step 1 when we're describing the problem. Maybe right from the beginning, it would have been obvious and we could have worked through that more quickly to get to the rest of the process. Now, one more tip I just want to share with you, because I find this fascinating, is that neuroscience shows that when you're experiencing positive emotions, it expands the scope of your thinking and your attention. So if you find yourself avoiding solving a problem because for you, there's something that's blocking you to feel some negative emotions around it. So here's the tip based on neuroscience. Try doing something that's going to result in positive emotions, that's going to unblock that for you. So an example would be go, chat with a friend in the office, work on something you really enjoy for a little while, an assignment, project, or task that really brings you a lot of satisfaction. Take a walk outside for a few minutes. Whatever it is, whatever little thing puts you in a better mood, then go back to working on the problem. And you would pick up by, generating solutions, brainstorming possible alternatives. So I know that you can get stuck solving a problem, especially if it's something you don't want to face. There's something, emotion that you're experiencing that's causing you to be stuck. Okay, it could be a lot of different possibilities there. Now, the third and final skill is impulse control. Now, impulse control, just like it sounds, right? It's the ability to resist an impulse to act quickly. Now, for me, I generally think of 2 different scenarios for this skill. I categorize them into 2, but these could be intermingled. But let me explain. The first scenario is someone who's a hothead, right? They don't seem to be able to put the brakes on being angry or aggressive. They might be explosive, unpredictable. They don't seem to have much self-control. So when they get frustrated, it spills out of them, right? They say what's on their mind. They don't think it through before they speak. They come across as a hothead or a whiner. Take your pick. The second scenario is someone who doesn't look before they leap. They're impulsive. They may jump to conclusions and take action before really thinking it through. So I generally look at those as 2 different scenarios. So when you think impulse control, those are 2 scenarios that for me are the easiest to imagine. So think about the impact that either of these scenarios would have in your own career. If you're seen as a hothead, you may be seen as unreliable, not trustworthy, or dependable. Maybe you're too controlling. You're too unpredictable. You're not a team player. Other people don't really want to work with you. And I have seen this derail people's careers where because they couldn't control their temper, their aggressive behavior, it affected maybe their colleagues, their team, etc. They didn't get the promotion, they didn't get the job they maybe really wanted, or they didn't keep their job, right? So that one is clear that impulse control can really lead down the wrong path. Now, if you're someone who's seen as, you don't look before you leap, that's not good either because you may be seen as unreliable with important decisions. In either case, if you don't exercise impulse control with great skill, it can absolutely derail your leadership career. So here's where I want to tell you what the 4 skills are. I mentioned 2 of them tonight, but there's actually 4 emotional intelligence skills that are seen as so crucial to all other skills that they're viewed as leadership derailers, okay? And I told you we'd cover 2 of them in this episode. Now, the 2 we covered that could be derailers are problem solving and impulse control, okay? Those are 2 that if you can't master them, That's going to really have a big impact in your career. Now, the other two, independence, which I've covered in a prior episode, and stress tolerance, which I'll be covering in the next episode. So those are the four that could derail you: problem solving, impulse control, independence, and stress tolerance. You really need to master all four of those. So when it comes to impulse control, I just want to share a couple of tips on what you could do. When something happens that really pushes your buttons, it makes you want to leap into action, explode, take your pick. It's simple. Take 5 deep breaths. Give yourself 30 seconds to identify what you want to say or do next. You've got to push pause. Breathe deep and catch yourself. Because if you don't, then again, we just got through talking about the negative behavior and how it can impact, your career and your effectiveness. Now, the second tip is when you're speaking with others, be sure to avoid interrupting them. And it's regardless of whether you're excited and you just want to chime in because you're so eager to talk about the subject, or you're really irritated and you're jumping all over what they're saying because you have a different viewpoint. It doesn't matter whether your intentions are good or bad. Don't interrupt when someone else is talking. Impulse control is being able to remain silent and listening until there's an opening and then politely share what you want to say. Now, the next tip is when you know that you're going to be having a conversation with either one other person or a group, and you know that conversation is going to be really ripe for pushing your buttons, prepare yourself in advance by making a list of the specific behaviors that you want to use during the conversation. Really think it through. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're going into a meeting where the tensions are going to be really high. Maybe this meeting is going to be about restructuring the organization or making some cuts or delaying a client project or, any topic that could be highly charged emotionally. Because we're not talking about every single meeting that you would have to think this, but it's one that will have high emotions, an emotionally charged topic. Think about how you want to express yourself based on what your tendencies are. Now, I know for me, being a hothead has never been my issue. My biggest challenge is I get really excited about a new initiative, a new project, and I might want to say, great, let's get started. I get really enthusiastic and it's genuine, but I've had to learn to put the brakes on before making a commitment because I would tend to want to jump in, let's get started, make a commitment. So instead, my practicing was saying, this looks good, I'll get back to you tomorrow, or can I get back to you by the end of the week, or whatever the time frame was, but to give myself at least a day to think it over, maybe longer, depends on what it is, and not commit right on the spot if it's not necessary. Now, my point being, you may be a hothead or you might be a leap before you look, right? So whatever your tendency is, just be self-aware so that when you go into a really important meeting that's going to challenge you, you want to think ahead of time. Okay, so if I'm going into a meeting and I know this could be complex, a big project, I might say to myself, okay, we have to scope it out and really look at resources and schedule and so forth before committing. So I would know going into a meeting, what's my position going to be so that I don't get caught defaulting to a natural tendency. Okay, so think your meeting over before you go in. Okay, so that is a wrap for this session. We've covered reality testing, which was my favorite, problem solving, and impulse control. And as I mentioned, problem solving and impulse control are both so critical that if you don't give some thought to your skill in those areas, those could be a make or break. So you can really stand out from the crowd if you really strengthen those skills. Okay. So if you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. You can simply go to thesuccesstalkshow.com and click on the subscribe button. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and have a great day.